This video introduces infrared neurofeedback, which is the basis of two of the applications in the suite. Neurofeedback is a form of biofeedback that's based on a direct measurement of brain activity. In infrared neurofeedback, we measure infrared heat radiation coming from the head. The sensor is capable of detecting subtle changes in real time, which are the result of changes in the brain's metabolic activity. By metabolic activity, I mean energy-consuming processes in the cells. The brain's metabolic activity is related to mental activity. For example, if you need to pay close attention, then the brain needs to work harder, or at least some part of it does. The brain responds very rapidly to such demands, and the sensor is capable of picking up these short timescale changes. And this feedback gives you a means of training the brain at the physiological level. The idea is that an optimally functioning brain is the basis for optimal well-being and also cognitive performance. In other words, by training the brain at the physiological level, we're indirectly training at the psychological level. So things like concentration, working memory, and emotional balance. Neurofeedback leads to lasting change. It stimulates structural change in the brain, or neuroplasticity. The software presents the measurement as an infrared temperature. In this graphic, the yellow trace on the left shows the variation of infrared temperature. You're training this graph to go upwards. The chart on the right shows the rate of change of infrared temperature. It's the equivalent of the slope or gradient of the left-hand chart. You can see that when the temperature is increasing, as it is here, the rate of change graph goes above zero and shows us green here. The faster the increase, the higher the green trace goes. When the temperature starts to fall, as it does here, the rate of change goes below zero and shows as red here. In infrared neurofeedback, the standard site for the sensor is the center of the forehead. The region of the brain behind your forehead is the prefrontal cortex, and it's a critically important part of the brain. It's been described as the brain's executive control center. Let's consider what functions it's involved in. Firstly, the ability to hold the mind steady in its focus, and also the ability to choose the focus. Then there's the ability to formulate a considered plan of action and to hold to it in spite of distracting influences, as well as to update it appropriately. At a higher level, this is the ability to formulate goals and purposes in life, and even values. In other words, the PFC helps to control and direct emotional drive and motivation. Then there's emotional balance. Although we don't have direct control over emotions, the prefrontal cortex can temper over-arousal or overstimulation. It can also call up energy in the absence of stimulation, so you're less likely to fall into emotional flatness or under-arousal. Emotions get expressed as bodily responses, things like a pounding heart when you're anxious. So the PFC is involved in body regulation as well. Another key skill is empathy. It's the ability to appreciate the minds of other people and to understand how our own behavior impinges upon them. Ultimately, this includes our moral awareness. These skills are collectively known as executive function. So how do you go about increasing metabolic activity in the prefrontal cortex? How do you actually apply your mind? Imagine you can be intensely alert and awake, very focused in the present moment. Imagine something vitally important is happening, something you'll remember for the rest of your life. So the mind is rapt, poised and ready, and the senses are heightened. Your consciousness is vivid and clear. Imagine you could turn up the vividness dial on your mind. Find some positive motivation. You really have to want the graph to go upwards. Imagine you had some sort of psychic power so that the force of your intent could move it. Focus on the graph and will it upwards. And yet at the same time remain calm and open, with a spacious awareness. So a kind of sense of urgency, but without being flustered. Another method is to imagine energy powering up the front of your head in some way. Imagine the PFC is like an engine and you're getting it into gear and revving it up. Or imagine blood coursing to the front of the head. It's also worth considering what gets in the way, or what causes drops in the brain's metabolic activity. Firstly, states like boredom, daydreaming or drifting off into low-energy distraction, and sleepiness. Secondly, negative emotions like anxiety and frustration. These can be triggered by negative judgments of your own performance, or perhaps by thoughts and memories that just happen to pop into the mind. Bear in mind that the brain does have limited resources. Another cause is real brain fatigue. Sometimes the graph does go down. You can't maintain intense focus indefinitely. If you get frustrated or self-critical, it'll generally work against you. Instead, take mini breaks before re-engaging your intent. An important point to make here is be careful not to overtrain. As with physical exercise, there's a window of potential. Not enough effort, and nothing really changes in the longer term. But overdo it and you risk over-tiring the brain and perhaps giving yourself a headache. When you first start training, I suggest no more than 5 minutes of active training at a time, but you can probably quite quickly build up to 20-minute sessions or longer. Another practical point to bear in mind is the system is likely to show steadily increasing temperature for the first few minutes regardless of what your brain is doing, as the sensor finds its equilibrium. It's probably more productive to wait for a few minutes before starting active training.